arranging this hearing. I thank the witnesses. I apologize for arriving late. I've caught up on some of what has transpired. I'd like to ask Dr. Weller, if I may, a little bit about the savings problem. You state that low and middle income workers are particularly vulnerable in retirement because of low levels of savings, and you suggest the use of various kinds of progressive incentives. Could you describe a little bit more, if you haven't already put this in the record, dollar-for-dollar matching, tax credits, et cetera, to encourage savings? And who would provide those incentives? I mean, is this going to be another obligation of the federal government? How could that be done?
There's basically, I think, the way I would describe it, three different approaches. They all would require essentially taking back the current tax incentives for saving, largely the tax deductibility of contributions to qualified plans, and replacing them with something else. You have Professor Ghilarducci's proposal where everybody would get a $600 flat amount. You have the proposal of my colleague and friend Gene Sperling, where it would be a match of, I think 20% is Gene's proposal, if I remember that correctly. Again, it's intended to be revenue neutral in that case by taking back some of the tax deductions that you have. And then the third part that a number of people, including myself, have proposed is to to give additional matches to low-income people, let's say a 2-for-1 match or 3-for-1 match for low-income family workers that would gradually be phased out. Again, that could be done either revenue neutral by taking back some of the tax deduction incentives that you have, or by taking back some of the tax cuts that were implemented since 2001 and pay for that, for instance, some of the estate tax reductions. So those are generally the three approaches to make the tax incentives under the current system substantially more progressive.
Mr. Orsag or others, would you care to comment on the effectiveness of those kinds of incentives?
I would say the effectiveness of the current tax system is relatively low in encouraging net additions to saving. And I touched upon this earlier, but the reason is that the current tax incentives are tilted towards, for each dollar of contribution, towards higher income households who more easily can shift assets, and the evidence suggests that's what they do. They shift assets from from taxed accounts into the tax preferred accounts, and that's not, when you're just shifting assets around, you're not getting any new saving. So a lot of these ideas are aimed at trying to focus the incentives on lower and moderate income households who don't have as many other assets, and therefore any dollar, other assets outside of retirement accounts, any dollar that shows up in a 401k plan from them is much more likely to be new saving rather than just asset shifting, and that's important.
Dr. Ghilarducci.
Yeah, I used to be a fan of progressive incentives, and that experiment's over. My reading of the research is that the systems that work either in this country and when people are defined benefit systems, big employer groups, or in the Netherlands, Australia, and other systems, the only thing that works is a mandatory tier on top of a basic state plan. In this country, be Social Security. So I have proposed a mandatory universal pension system on top of Social Security, where workers would save 5% of their income all their working lives, and much of that would be subsidized by a rearranging of the government subsidies that we have now that don't work for 401ks.
Quickly, in the moment that I have remaining, let me ask about what appears to be a disincentive, which is something known as Reserve Plus, that allows you to have a debit card where you can draw on your 401k, pay it back over 60 months at 2.9% above prime. Should we allow that?
I'm usually not a big fan of outlawing financial products, but I call this the subprime version of the 401k world. Yes, because it's exactly 3% more. It is enormously punitive. It's exactly the wrong direction to go in 401ks. And I know that members of Congress have proposed outlawing it, and I think that's probably the right direction.
And just in follow-up to the comment about the progressive versus mandate, to me, it's either or. In other words, if you mandate the system, it works. If you don't mandate the system, then it has to be progressive. The small employer is the one who the employee of the small employer has the lowest 401k account balance. They have about 1/3 of what the average account balance of a Fortune 500 company. They typically also do not have a defined benefit plan, so they have the smallest amount. So there has to be incentives for the small employer to establish 401k plans, which are tax incentives for the highly paid people. And that works to some degree, not to a perfect degree. To take that away and not go to a mandatory system is probably not going to work. It's one or the other.
Could I just add one other counterproductive thing, which is that in many cases we are encouraging people to save in 401ks and IRAs, and then it's often the case, and people will experience this to some degree during an economic downturn like today, that because of the asset tests that apply in programs like Medicaid and food stamps and other means-tested benefit programs, we've encouraged people to save, and then if they do, we often then cut off their access to programs that help them during economic downturns, which from a purely rational economics perspective, is effectively a tax on saving. So on the one hand, we're trying to encourage saving through the tax code. On the other hand, we have a huge potential disincentive to saving through the asset tests that apply to many of these programs, although there have been some improvements recently.
Thank you. I'm a little concerned that we're here having this discussion and we're using the language that might be appropriate to yesterday, last year, 2000. We act as if this is the same, and if you just hang on